Hello, my name is Masanao Takeyama. I would like to present our research on designing for behavioral and institutional changes. Knowledge of behavioral sciences, such as psychology and behavioral economics, has recently been applied to design of products and services to support their users' behavioral changes. In a practice of such a design approach, or behavioral design, designers define some gaps between expected and actual action. Then they diagnose psychological barriers against expected action and find out appropriate intervention strategies. Based on these strategies, they develop touchpoints and interactions to realize the interventions. There is another design approach called service ecosystem design, which also aims at changing service actors' behavioral routines. Differently from behavioral design, service ecosystem design pays attention to institutions of service system such as rules, norms, and symbols. Those institutions facilitate and constrain actors' behavioral routine of service interaction. At the same time, these behavioral routines of service interaction support and reproduce the institutions. So there is a mutual reinforcing relationships between behavior and institutions. Service ecosystem design invites various actors of service interactions in design process to let them reflect on their taken for granted routines and institutions and ask them explore the possibilities of reforming these institutions. Despite the differences of two design approaches, we got interested in their mutually complementary relationships. In particular, we can expect that institutional perspective of service ecosystem design helps to add a deeper contextual layer for behavioral design. Also, the techniques of behavioral design support the implementation of institutional transformations. We tested this possibility of integrating two design approaches with a corporate project as a pilot study. The purpose of this corporate project was to transform their salesperson's behaviors from solving customers' known problems to discovering unknown opportunities using design thinking. For this purpose, the company's service design lab introduced design thinking to some selected salespersons and trained them as design thinking ambassadors to practice it at each local sales hub of the company. In particular, these design thinking ambassadors were expected to have design thinking workshops with their customers to discover new business opportunities. At the same time, some designers of Service Design Lab were assigned as mentors to support these practices of design thinking ambassadors. However, 2 years after the launch of the project, the director of the Service Design Lab realized that most of the ambassadors prioritized selling ready-made solutions over practicing design thinking to find new business opportunities. Also, the mentors were very passive, just waiting for receiving questions from the ambassadors instead of actively helping them. So we built a research team to try to apply the integrated design approach to this behavioral problem. We targeted the passive design thinking mentors as primary actors for behavioral changes, though we also paid attention to behaviors of other stakeholders as necessary. The integrated approach was implemented in 3 stages. At the first stage, we interviewed the targeted design thinking mentors and defined the behavior expectation gaps to focus on. Then we had diagnosis sessions to understand the target actors' psychological barriers against expected actions using a behavioral decision-making framework. The result of these research and analysis were visualized in a user journey format like this picture. The yellow arrows represent influences of psychological barriers on the actions of design thinking mentors. Then, following the process of behavioral design, we could generate intervention strategies applying the knowledge of behavioral sciences to overcome the recognized barriers. For example, we could come up with an intervention strategy that enhances the target actor's goals and implementation intentions, or another strategy that stimulates the actor's self-awareness. However, instead of ideating intervention strategies right after the behavioral diagnosis, we moved on to the second stage of psychological and institutional analysis. Here, based on the research on the target actor and their work contexts, we looked at the relationships among their mental models, psychological barriers, and some organizational institutional factors such as their goals, KPIs, and norms. Through this analysis, for example, we discovered several contradictions between norms of sales division and KPIs for design thinking ambassadors, and these contradictions influence the mental models of the mentors to behave cautiously to the ambassadors. Such a mental model further causes negative reactions of the mentors to support actively the practice of the ambassadors. We visualized those kinds of information in a map like this to share and correct our understanding both inside and outside the research team. Such a representation helped participants of this study, who are actually employees of this company, to understand their invisible and complex institutional problems from the perspectives of observable behavior and psychological barriers which are easy for them to empathize with. In the stage 3, based on the findings of psychological institutional analysis, we discussed possible institutional change strategies to promote expected behaviors of both the mentors and ambassadors. The proposed strategies here were those resulting to changing the roles, relationships, and goals of the mentors and ambassadors. One designer who participated in this pilot study recognized the benefit of the integrated design approach by mentioning that once we grasped the whole picture, we could uncover what should be essentially changed. Since institutional changes often demand corresponding changes in the mental models and behaviors, we could anticipate some psychological barriers of target actors against these change strategies. So we further developed ideas of behavioral intervention applying behavioral science to overcome such barriers and promote expected institutional changes. Based on the findings from this study, we proposed several hypothetical advantages of integrating behavioral design and service ecosystem design. First, the integrative approach facilitates deeper understanding of the context of behavior change by representing the relations of psychological barriers and institutional constraints. Such a representation helps design participants to broaden their perspective to recognize the influence of contradicting rules and norms on the behavior of target actors. Secondly, the proposed approach prevents behavioral designers from losing opportunities for more innovative intervention. It means that the approach helps design participants to grasp the whole picture and uncover what should be essentially changed. Thirdly, it can guide invisible institutional changes based on visible behavior changes, meaning that it helps to figure out what institutional changes are appropriate and necessary based on whether they enable and sustain the desirable behavior changes. Finally, the approach enhances the practicability of service ecosystem design by nudging expected behavior of target actors, in addition to resulting to their conscious reflexivity for changing their mental models. This is a conclusion and topics of future research. For these and other details not mentioned in this movie, please look at the paper in the conference proceedings. Thank you very much.